So welcome everybody. This is like Mary Beth said, the third part of our series. Hopefully you've been able to attend one of the first two sessions on the basics of creating a funding proposal and then budget development as well. So today's session is going to focus on system-to-system submission of a Grants.gov proposal and the SF-424 module within the Research UVA powered by Huron system. So hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I occasionally have connection issues, so please let me know if I start to break up or anything like that. But just to quickly go through today's agenda, we're going to go through some basic training tips and housekeeping reminders. We're going to talk about resources and support that's going to be available, resources that are currently available and some things we're going to have in the future, and then support opportunities both before go live and post go live of the new Research UVA powered by Huron system. We're also going to go over just a basic overview of a Grants.gov proposal and looking at how all of the different pieces of the funding proposal, the budget, and the SF-424 modules within the Huron system fit together. I'll do a demonstration of creation of a funding proposal for a Grants.gov submission, and then we'll go through our hands-on exercise, and then we'll have some wrap-up comments at the end. So hopefully everyone knows me, but just in case you don't, I'm Lauren Armstrong. I'm the Assistant Director of the Office of Grants and Contracts in the School of Medicine, and Stephen Cornelison is also with us. He bravely led the initial session on this while I was out of the country. So I'm gonna try to lead this one, bear the burden of this one on my own, but Stephen and I are both here if anyone has any questions as we move through today's session. So just some quick housekeeping reminders and training tips. Obviously, try to keep yourself on mute if you're not talking or asking a question. We are certainly open to questions and are happy to answer those as we go through the session. Please, interrupt me at any point to ask any questions that you might have, but just to minimize any background noise. Otherwise, keep yourself muted. We don't necessarily require anybody to be on video. I'm not on video myself because of bandwidth issues, and I think in the past we've had, because this is a large group, we've had some bandwidth issues if there are a lot of videos plus the screen share happening at one time, so don't feel obligated to turn on your video. Again, questions at any time, questions in the chat are terrific as well. And then, as Mary Beth mentioned, we'll go into breakout rooms for our live exercises, and those will each be facilitated by members of the Huron core team. And so you'll have someone there to answer questions and help talk you through anything you might get stuck on as you're working through the exercise. So some of the resources and support that are available currently, and then some things that are going to be happening in the future. Obviously, the Research UVA powered by Huron website is up and running, and there's a lot of good information there about the timelines, which I know have been modified recently. So keeping on top of the current timeline and other resources that are available, such as the reference guides, the job aids, checklists. There are going to be videos as well. There should be a video of each of the instructor-led training sessions that will be posted before go live, which is still currently scheduled for April the 25th. Hopefully everyone is also aware that we've moved to a soft launch for that April 25th go live, and I think that's going to be a real advantage for everyone because it allows us to sort of familiarize ourselves with the new system at maybe a more manageable pace, but also keeps Research UVA or Legacy Research UVA available for transactions as we move into the new system. We're really hoping that as of April 25th, everyone will use the Research UVA powered by Huron system for new transactions for proposals and agreements, but transactions related to existing awards. So things like renewal or resubmission proposals, any sort of eSPAR type transaction or SP30s related to existing awards will continue to be processed through the Legacy Research UVA system. But please take advantage of the opportunity to use the new system, again, at maybe a more manageable pace to submit your new proposals and new agreements, whether those are non-funded agreements or clinical trials, for example, can all be submitted through Research UVA powered by Huron. So as I mentioned, these instructor-led training sessions have been presented in a series, and there will be recordings made available on the website prior to go live. There's also going to be office hours after go live for the first 2 weeks, and then probably continuing after that as needed. But those will be open Zoom sessions. They're drop-in type sessions where we encourage you to come with your real life examples, a real activity that you're working on that you might have questions about. There will be representatives from the core team, which will include all of the submitting schools as well, and should have someone there to be able to help you work through those issues. I know that School of Medicine, as well as I believe education and possibly engineering, are going to also have pre-go live office hours. So if you have questions or want to talk through any sort of upcoming proposal that you may have or upcoming issues that you might be thinking through ahead of time, there are going to be some pre-go live office hours available as well. And then post go live, there will also be help desk support, so more technical type support that will be managed by the OSP info team, and the email address for help desk support is on your screen, but is ruva-huron-help@virginia.edu. So with our system-to-system submission opportunities within Research UVA powered by Huron, there will be some change from current practices, but some things will also stay the same. And so what is changing as we move into this new world where we can use our Huron system to submit directly into Grants.gov? So many federal Grants.gov submissions will now be submitted directly through Huron. It won't necessarily be all of them. There are some interface issues, I believe, with FastLane and some other federal sponsors that we may not use the Huron system for. That could include DoD. I believe NEH also falls into that category, and there may be others. Those will sort of be managed on a transaction by transaction basis. So if you are unsure if for any reason if your proposal can or should be submitted system to system, please check with your submitting office, whether that's in your school or with OSP, and we can help you figure that out and manage the submission of each of those proposals. The other thing that this sort of brings is that whereas in the current world, we have kind of multiple systems that we're checking against each other and that we're keeping quality control across different platforms. Now we have the opportunity to review the funding proposal, the budget, and the SF-424 forms all in one system. They're all connected within the Huron system, and you can easily navigate between those sections or those modules. And so information also feeds from one place to the other, and we'll discuss that today, kind of the flow of information across each of those modules. But I think that's a real advantage and helps to sort of streamline and create some efficiency as far as both preparing and reviewing our funding proposals. But some things are also staying the same, and so as I mentioned, there are some types of proposals that will not be submitted through the system-to-system functionality within Huron. In addition to those I've already mentioned, those will also include complex proposals or multi-component proposals, such as program projects, P awards, some types of U's, any NIH award that has multi components. Those will continue to be submitted through either Workspace or Assist. And then also support from OSP in your submitting office will not change. You will still work with your grants office, whoever that may be, and they will continue to assist you in putting those submissions through whatever system you'll be using for that proposal. So our objectives today are to create and to learn how to create and update the SF-424 module in Assist. And we're also going to do some review of a funding proposal and budget, just to make sure that we sort of understand how information flows from those modules into the SF-424. And we're going to look at the flow of each of those processes shortly. So an overall funding proposal workflow, this is probably something that you have seen in some of your previous sessions, but just to review quickly, you're going to start with your study team or your study staff creating the proposal, and that proposal will live in the draft state as you're working through the completing the funding proposal, the budget, and the SF-424. When you're ready to move those pieces forward, you're going to send that through a department review level, and that process may vary by school or submitting unit. So there may be 1 or 2 layers of department review depending on what school you sit in. But at that department review, there could be a feedback loop where your department reviewer sends the proposal back to the study staff or the PI for some clarifications. When they're happy with that, they'll send it forward to specialist review. So your specialist is going to be the staff member, either an OSP or your submitting school's grants office, who's responsible for submission of that proposal. Again, at this point, there's a there's a feedback loop, and if your specialist has questions or identifies updates or changes that are needed, they can send that back to the study staff or the PI for those changes, either going through the department review again or bypassing the department review, depending on the nature of those changes. And then once the proposal is identified to be complete and ready for submission, the specialist will move that into a pending submission to sponsor state. And then once the submission is completed through Grants.gov, it will move into a pending sponsor review state, which is where it will sit until it is either identified as being not funded or is receives a request for just in time, or hopefully an award notice, at which point it will move into one of the 3 states that identifies either of those statuses, and then hopefully we ultimately end up in an awarded state. Sort of tangential to this whole process, you'll see the light blue bubble over here on the right hand side that identifies ancillary reviews. So at different points in the process, we can use the system to request ancillary reviews from other stakeholders that are identified within this proposal. And that could be anything from approval for a cost share, it may be an F&A waiver, it could be needing to identify a PI who may not normally be eligible, but who is going to submit a proposal under an expanded exception. So within that overall proposal workflow, we also have a particular workflow for the SF-424 module within the Huron system. And as we work through this later in our demonstration, you'll see that these statuses or these states that the proposal moves through are separate from the statuses on the funding proposal itself. So once you've created the SF-424 in the system, it'll be in a pre-submission state. As you're working through adding your attachments and completing your form fields, it will remain in that state until it is validated for submission. Once it's valid for submission, it's gone through validation checks and hopefully, is error-free and can then be submitted to Grants.gov. There's a potential, although very, very small, that there's some type of error not identified within the Huron validation checks. And this varies again by sponsor and by funding opportunity type. So the most extensive checks that Huron offers are sort of mirror the checks that NIH does within their ERA Commons system, but some of the other sponsors, they have not quite as extensive an opportunity for checking or validating the proposal as NIH does. And so once the proposal is submitted, it could be potentially rejected with errors, and we would need to fix those and resubmit, but hopefully it moves through the Grants.gov process And as you'll see there, it kind of quickly moves through those standard statuses that we see once we've submitted something to Grants.gov until it gets to the validated point and then received by the federal funding agency. So how do we put all of the information together in Huron in the various modules? So again, we have our funding proposal, we have our budget, and we have our SF-424. And as we go through our demonstration, you'll see how each of these works together, but an overview here kind of shows you that information that we enter into the funding proposal and then information that we enter into the budget both come together and feed into the SF-424 module. Any information that you put into the funding proposal and budget will move forward. And then once you've created your SF-424 and included the forms that you need, whether those be potentially a detailed budget or a modular budget, you may want to add your assignment request form. The SF-424 activity functions very similar to the way that we see it in Assist or in Workspace and Grants.gov today. And so once that activity is created, it pulls forward all of that information we've already put into our funding proposal and our budget and consolidates it in the SF-424. But also there are additional fields in the SF-424 that will need to be completed that aren't included in those previous funding proposal or budget modules. So within the funding proposal, you're entering things like the title, the sponsor, your key personnel, you're entering information about human or animal subjects. You can also upload your bio sketches to the funding proposal. All of that will then push forward to your SF-424 and populate those SF-424 forms with that information. Within your budget, you want to ensure that if you have multiple versions of your budget, if you have multiple drafts, that you have identified which ones you want to include in your final consolidated budget. There is a question on the budget information smart form that you should have seen in your earlier session on budget development, but it allows you to identify any draft that you want to include, and then you can exclude drafts that you may be working on and have decided to discard. You can't actually delete those from the system. They do remain as a living record, but you can choose which ones to include in that final version. And then the Huron system also allows you to upload your subaward budget. So, you know, this is something that probably many of you are already doing with your Assist or your Workspace proposals. But you can download the subaward budget form, send it to your subaward site, and have them complete it with all of their particular information, and then you can upload that right back into the Huron system, so that you don't have to manually enter all of the information from your subaward budget. And then in the SF-424, as we mentioned, there are a number of fields that map forward from the funding proposal and the budget, but all of those do remain editable. So if you need to make changes, or if there are fields that are incomplete or don't map forward from the funding proposal, you can add the information into the SF-424 module. You will upload almost all of your attachments directly into the SF-424, with the exception being the biosketch and potentially other support if that's something that's required by your funding opportunity. Both of those can be included in the funding proposal. It's very important to sort of remember, and we'll talk about this also as we go through our demonstration, but that information that maps forward from the budget or the funding proposal does not map backwards from the SF-424 to those modules. So if you make changes in your SF-424 to your budget, for example, or to your title, then you will need to go back and make those changes in your funding proposal. And actually, sort of the preferable process would be to make those changes in the funding proposal and then update your SF-424 to refresh that information forward, rather than trying to manage it manually in two different places. So putting it all together, again, talking about making changes that may need to be made once you've completed your SF-424. If you need to go backwards to make changes in your funding proposal or your budget, then you can make those changes in Huron, and then you can push them forward to the SF-424, identifying only the forms that need changes made. So what you will see as you work through your exercise later is that if you make a change and you push those forward to the SF-424 without identifying only the specific forms that need changing, the SF-424 will be completely updated. And so if you had entered information previously, it may be overwritten or it may be blanked out. So if you only need to make changes to your budget, for example, then when you push those changes forward, you select only your budget forms and everything else will remain the same. You won't have to make any other additions or changes there. So I'll do a live demonstration of the proposal preparation. Again, we'll go through a review of the funding proposal and the budget, and then we'll work specifically through the SF-424. Hopefully, again, you've attended previous sessions, and so the review for the funding proposal and the budget will not be new to you. But again, if you have any questions as we move through this, please let me know. We will create a budget, or I have already created a budget. We'll talk through some of that information. We can also review how to submit a modular budget. Our demo is going to be on a detailed budget today, but we can certainly also review a modular budget. And then I'll show you how to create and complete the SF-424. We will not work through the full workflow of submitting these items forward through department review and specialist review in the demo, but if in your breakout rooms you do want to work through that functionality, then you may be able to work either with your breakout room facilitator or with somebody else in your room who could potentially act as your department reviewer to provide feedback and to provide sort of an example of how that workflow progresses. All right. So let me switch over to my Huron system here. Hopefully everybody can see my dashboard. Let me know if not. But so just to orient you, again, hopefully this is review for those of you who have attended earlier sessions. But to orient you, when you first log in to the Huron system, you'll be redirected to your dashboard, which is going to be an overview of all the items that you have the opportunity to act on. You can navigate to different sections either through your recently viewed tab if there's something in particular you've been working on. If you have deadlines pending, they'll show up in this box here. But then you can also drill down directly to other modules within the system. So today we're working on grants and not agreements, but you can come over to your grants tab to identify, again, grant activities that you have available to you to work on. Sorry, we're going to be at the mercy of my rural internet service here a little bit today. All right, so once I'm here on my grants dashboard, I could create my funding proposal. I've already created a demonstration that we're going to work from today. But if you are looking to create a new funding proposal, if for your exercise later you don't have a funding proposal from a previous session to work through, please let us know. Actually, in the chat now would be awesome, and then we can get a funding proposal package ready for you to work through. But so within your dashboard here, you can search either by through different tabs, through different statuses. If you know the state of the activity that you're trying to work on, you can also filter and search with this box here. You've probably heard in earlier sessions, but the percentage sign is your wildcard, and that's going to be your friend to make sure that you can actually pull up exactly what you're looking for without too specific a search term. But you can filter by each of these column heads here, so that if you know you're looking for your funding proposal ID number and you know that, you can search it that way, or if you know the title or the name that you've given that transaction. All right, so this is a funding proposal example that I started for today's session. You'll see that it's in draft state. I have not moved it forward to department review yet. And again, just a sort of a review of navigation and some of the kind of terminology that we're going to be using in the Research EVA powered by Huron system. This is your funding proposal workspace. You can always identify which workspace you're in by the identifying box over here in the top right corner. It'll identify your funding proposal number or the number of your SF-424 budget, whatever item you're working on. But you have your basic proposal information in the middle of the screen here. This will show you who the PI is. It will show you your submitting department and your named specialist, which should be identified by the system automatically based on your submitting office and the portfolio assignments that have been made for your school or department. It will show you the basic budget information and date of your budget period. It'll show you the sponsor submission deadline and also an internal submission deadline if you've identified those. If you're in a school or a unit that has internal deadline policy, this is an easy way to keep track of exactly when your item might be due, if that's different from the sponsor's deadline. You'll see a number of activities over here on the left-hand side. These are all activities that will be available to you for the funding proposal or the activity that you're working on. We won't go through all of these today, but you can see that obviously there's your submit for department review. When you're ready for that step, this is where we will come to create or update our SF-424. We can manage our ancillary reviews if we needed, again, something like a cost share approval or an FNA waiver. We can manage those through these activities over here. We won't go through each of these tags today, but these are certainly things that we can talk through either in our breakout rooms or in maybe some of the office hours that are going to be offered either pre-go live or post-go live. All right, so there's a question in the chat. Is there a screen that will show the project title? So once we get into the funding proposal smart form, you will see that the full title is identified there, but the short title, which is this that you're seeing here, I've used the date with my initials. That's what will be most visible on the various dashboards and lists that you'll find. So this is going to be really important to familiarize yourself with as you're preparing your funding proposal or your agreement, because that's going to be the identifier that you'll see most often. We have discussed within the core team and we'll provide in some of the resources that are going to be available some standard naming conventions so that we can help easily identify the different types of transactions within both OSP and submitting schools, and then also for you in the departments as well. All right, in the chat, in the deadlines, in the left column when you log in, this is populate interim reports, et cetera. So, okay, so the question is about, I think back over here on the dashboard. Sorry, again, just a quick second to maneuver back over here. But Royan, I think your question is about the My Deadlines box that was down at the bottom here, and whether or not this populates interim reports. These are specific to deadlines we've identified within our system. There is an opportunity to create a deliverable schedule when an award is set up. And if you're able to attend an award session either later this week, I believe later this week is the next one, there is a designated review process that OSP will go through with the schools and departments as they're setting up awards to identify a schedule for deliverables, so things like technical reports and financial reports potentially, and also budget information. But those deadlines, I don't believe the interim reports populate in the My Deadlines box. These are specific to deadlines that have been identified on the funding proposals, but those deliverables are associated with notifications that will go out at certain intervals prior to the due date for those. So you can see I just had, so just as a demonstration of this recently viewed box, the funding proposal I was in, because I just got out of it, is now showing up at the top of my recently viewed actions. And so I can navigate directly back to it from here without going back through my grants tab. All right, so back on my funding proposal, we've talked about the workspace and the various activities. I'm going to, again, this is hopefully a review for everybody, but I'm going to go into edit the funding proposal and work through the smart form so that we can talk about information that populates forward into the SF-424, so that you can sort of be thinking about and putting those things together as you are preparing your proposal. All right, so you should land on this general proposal information page when you first log into your funding proposal. And also just a reassurance on the speed of things here. So this is a test system that we're working in, and there are a number of people logged in now, obviously, for the activities that we're going to be doing in a little bit. The actual production system that's available at Go Live will not have some of this sort of inherent slowness to it. So you'll work through these initial funding proposal smart forms, including information about the type of application. The short title of the proposal we just talked about being the main identifier that you're going to see. This is where you will identify the long title of your proposal and your principal investigator. One note about principal investigator here, this defaults to the person who initiates the funding proposal. So if you are not the principal investigator, you may need to change that away from your name. It's easy to kind of skip over because it's not terribly obvious that it needs to be changed, but just keeping that in mind. Selecting your direct sponsor here, again, as we have worked through some previous sessions, I know this is an area that has kind of given people a little bit of difficulty in terms of being able to find the sponsor that you're looking for, making copious use of those wildcards so that you're able to pull up various a list of sponsors that hopefully hits exactly what you're looking for is going to be your best bet there. But if you don't have your sponsor available, you can always indicate a new sponsor listed here, and then there will be a follow-on question below that will ask you to identify some additional information like address of that sponsor so that they can be added to the database, very similar to the way that we do it in Legacy Research UVA now. And then if this were a subaward and there will be a flow-through sponsor, you can indicate that here as well. Your instrument type and the primary purpose of this project, these should be simple and familiar questions. Just knowing that this question number 7, the primary purpose of the project, is going to drive your default F&A rate as we work through the funding proposal. So making sure that you properly identify the purpose and the location of the project. And then also there will be additional follow-on questions for some of these, depending on what options you check. For example, an industry-funded clinical trial might open up additional options that you need to respond to. You indicate your expected start date of this proposal in question 8. And then the type of research, again, this should be a familiar question from our current research UVA system. And then one of the activities that we're really, really excited about for this new Huron system is the ability to generate current and pending support. So we have added this question 10 where you can indicate the goals or the aims of the project that will then in the future feed into that current and pending support report that we're able to pull out of the system. So this is not a required question, but is going to be incredibly helpful to you down the road to be able to populate that current and pending document. All right, so the personnel page is your next smart form page here. Again, program director, principal investigator feeds from the prior page. This is where you can upload a biosketch or other support that will then feed forward into your SF-424. The responsible department or party can be changed, but will default based on the workday association of the principal investigator selected. Question 3 is where you can add additional project personnel, whether they're key personnel within the institution or non-key personnel within the institution. You will add them here. And then if you had non-institutional key personnel, so a subaward PI, for example, you can add them here. You can add all of their information, their demographic information, phone numbers, addresses, email, all of that information is added into this pop-out box and then feeds forward into your SF-424 so that you don't have to re-key all of that later. You can also identify your administrative personnel. So your administrative contact, again, will default to the person who creates or initiates the funding proposal. But if you needed to add team members either within your department, within other departments, partnering units that need either edit or read-only rights to the funding proposal, you can add them here. This is going to be really helpful, I think, as we sort of work through these collaborative type proposals so that in the future you can access the records that your investigators or your faculty are working on. And we don't have those kind of walls or visibility issues that we have in Research UVA currently, where you can only access activity by org level. So submission information, these initial fields are populated forward from earlier smart forms based on information we've included there already. This question number 3 here is where you're going to indicate whether the application will be submitted system to system. If you had a different type of application, so for example, something being submitted through something like Proposal Central or another sponsor's platform and not Grants.gov, you'd obviously check no here. But today we're working through the SF-424 package. This is the test package that hopefully you've used to create your funding proposal in your previous session. This is a standard R01 package that we're going to use for our demonstration, but you do have the opportunity to search by any of these fields to find the funding opportunity that you're looking to work on. Once you've selected your funding opportunity, you're going to get a summary here of all of the SF-42 forms, both the required and the optional forms, and information about your funding opportunity. This is just summary information letting you know and sort of allowing you to identify and verify that that's the correct opportunity. And this is the smart form where you'll identify your basic budget information, your submission deadline here that we had seen on our funding proposal workspace is indicated on this form page. You could also potentially indicate a date that you expect a response from the sponsor if you happen to know that. That's not a required question. And then you've previously indicated the date that your project starts. The system defaults to a 5-year budget period. If you needed to modify that, you can either add or remove periods down here at the bottom. And if you wanted to switch from a detailed to a modular budget, you could do that via question 6 there. And then question 8 here, we have added specifically to identify internal submission deadlines. Again, if your school or unit has a deadline policy that requires information in advance of the sponsor's deadline, that's where you'll indicate it. So the next page is your basic compliance questions. This is where you'll indicate information about your human or animal subjects that will feed forward into your SF-424 package. As you can see, if you have indicated yes to some of these questions, you'll get additional pop-out information. For human and animal subjects, previously we had a binary response of approved or pending. If you select pending in this case, it's going to ask you for some information about the submitted protocol. So if you are intending to indicate that that you do not either have or want to provide that information at proposal stage, you would respond not yet submitted. That will translate into pending on the SF-424, but within the funding proposal smart form here, that will keep you from having to provide that specific information about your protocol. These other compliance questions are all things that you ought to be familiar with and hopefully have seen in earlier sessions. I won't go through them in detail, but provide additional information that your reviewer or your specialist may need to review your proposal. All right, just a couple of final questions, additional proposal information. Your applicant institution, this defaults to the rector and visitors, and other than in really particular cases where, for example, the UVA College at Wise might be submitting a proposal, this will always, should always be rector and visitors. We wouldn't expect to see anything else there in most cases. Program income, this is a question that feeds forward to the SF-424 as well. And then some additional questions about resources that may be needed internally for this proposal. Question 4 is where you would indicate your abstract, just like we do in Legacy Research UVA now. This information will feed into a database that you can choose either to make available to faculty and staff that may be searching, looking for collaborators or trying to identify types of proposals that have been submitted in the past. But this is now an opt-in option for our funding proposal abstracts. So once you've completed all of your funding proposal smart form pages, you will come to your final completion page where you can run a validation check on your smart forms and ensure that everything has been completed as necessary and expected. That validation button shows up over here on our left-hand side. Hopefully you get all green checks, and then you can click your finish button down in the bottom right corner here. So that should complete your funding proposal and take you back out to your funding proposal workspace, where your next step would then be to navigate to your budget workspace. So you can see that we haven't changed anything about the state of our funding proposal. It's still in draft. There are a number of tabs down here that will provide you additional information about your funding proposal. You hopefully have seen all of these in prior sessions, but if you, for example, were not sure who your reviewers were and wanted to know who would be able to review and approve this proposal, you could look at your reviewers list. And it will show you both the department approvals. It will show you who has been named as an administrative editor for your department. You could also see here if you had identified any ancillary reviews that were needed, they would show up in this reviewers tab. The history tab is also something that is going to be very, very useful to sort of keep an eye on activity associated with a funding proposal or other types of transactions. This history captures every action that's associated with this record in a chronological sort of timeline. And so this is a really good summary kind of way to review activity that is associated with your record or transaction. So far, all we've done is create the funding proposal, but you could see as we move through additional activities that that list will be updated. So our next step after creating our funding proposal, as I mentioned, is to move into our budget. You will have a budget that defaults with the title of your sponsor. If you want to change that title, you can do that. But we would click into our budget here, which will take us to our budget workspace. Again, identify workspace being identified by the title field over here in the top right corner. You'll see a summary of your financials that will give you the overview of your line items as well as your direct and indirect cost and your cost rate and base type. But then to make specific changes, we would go into the edit budget button to go through our budget smart forms. Again, these should be pretty familiar if you've attended previous sessions. I won't get too detailed with this, but you can indicate initially here if you do not have standard F&A cost base or rates, and then you would be able to identify other base types or another rate if that's what your sponsor provides. There's a detailed table for travel information if you want to go through a detailed travel calculation in question 4. This question 5 is where you would indicate whether or not you want to include this draft or this version of your budget in your final consolidated budget summary that we talked about earlier. If you had created a draft and you didn't need it and wanted to move on to something different, you can change this response to no. It will live on as an available record in the system, but will not be included in your final totals. You can indicate the salary cap here. This should default based on information included within the Huron system. As this changes from year to year, the system will be updated to reflect that. But if for some reason you had a sponsor using a different type of salary cap, or there was a delay, in the system update for some reason, you could manually edit that here. 7 and 8 are where you identify your inflation defaults. Your personnel costs definition. Oh, I made some changes to this last night. I forgot to feed forward. I apologize. But your personnel cost definition here, you can pull forward from your funding proposal. That's an activity that's only available one time. And so I had made changes to my funding proposal that I did not change here. So I would need to manually now change each of these to match the personnel on the funding proposal. I won't go through that today, but that's a good example of information that feeds forward from one section into another section of the transaction. But you identify each of your personnel here, and then on the personnel cost summary page, you would indicate effort and fringe rates for each of those personnel. So again, this should be familiar, hopefully, to you, but if you have any questions about how to populate any of this information as you're working through your exercise, please let us know, and we can go into more detail about updating and changing personnel information or any of these other cost categories. I'll just quickly go through each page. Trainee cost is not something that we will use very often. This is sort of generally what translates to like participant support information on an NIH proposal. So very often we'll skip over these sections here, but your general cost definition is where you would define all of your other OTPS items like supplies, travel if you haven't used the travel detail tool, animals, equipment, tuition, all of those things would be added through your general cost pages here. And again, once you've identified each category and your base cost amount, you would go to your summary page here where you can either edit or adjust those cost amounts across the out years of your budget period. If you needed to make changes, for example, if you only had equipment in year one and you wanted to zero this out for your remaining years, you can make that change here. One note about the budget, again, hopefully this was discussed in your previous session, but if you have indicated an inflation rate in the earlier smart form pages, you will not be able to manually edit those out years for your cost categories, because the system is automatically calculating that inflation for you. This F&A cost override page is generally not going to be available for changes to most people. It's editable to me because I have the specialist role, but this is generally a page that you would essentially just sort of skip over. And then the final page here would allow you to add any attachments. I believe, as we talked about in previous sessions, our standard practice is not going to be to add attachments within the smart forms here, but instead to add attachments on the workspace. So just to sort of show you what that would look like. If your school or unit required an internal budget, like spreadsheet, for example, or if you had some other supporting documentation that you wanted to include in your proposal, rather than add it to that smart form page, you would navigate back out to your funding proposal workspace and use the add attachments activity that would show up here on the left-hand menu column. So once you've identified all of your budget information, it'll take you back out to your workspace. Again, this is your summary of budget information. If you do need to create a subaward for your proposal, you would use your create subaward activity here, which I've already done. So it's going to take me over to, I can use my subaward tab to navigate over to that subaward that I've already created. So one thing that I wanted to point out here, particular to the SF-424, is that we talked earlier about the ability to use the import subaward budget option so that you don't have to manually key all of the information for your subaward into your SF-424. As you're working through your budget creation, there's sort of an idiosyncrasy in the system that in the smart form, you identify that you're going to import your subaward budget. And then the next page allows you to do that, to import that budget. But you may be asking, well, where do I get the form from? How do I do that? And so I wanted to talk through that just a little bit, because as at this point in most standard processes, you will not yet have created your SF-424. So once you have created your SF-424, the subaward budget will be made available to you to download. So if you have a sub and you identify subaward import as your detail option, then you may need to stop at this point with your budget and then go create your SF-424 so that you can download that form and send it to your sub site. You don't have to complete anything else on the SF-424 at that point, but it will allow you to download that form so that you can get your sub site moving on that process. I think also in previous budgeting sessions, it may have also been mentioned that NIH has and other federal sponsors have a forms repository that you may be able to download it from. I might suggest that you try to get the form associated with the particular package that you're working on, funding opportunity package, just to ensure that there's no disconnect between the form that you may download from a sponsor's website, for example, that may be an older version or may not be compatible with the form package that you're working from. So just to ensure compatibility, I think downloading it directly from the system here is the safest bet, but in a pinch, you can probably also get it from the web in a more general way. But just to sort of point out what I'm talking about. So this first page, you've identified subaward import as your detail title, and then the next page asks you to import that document. So at this point, you would exit out of your budget creation and then go create your SF-424 in order to get that form. So once you've exited out of your subaward budget, you're back on your workspace, your budget workspace here. You can navigate through the breadcrumbs back to your funding proposal. You also have a link here directly on your subaward budget workspace. And so at this point, whether you have a subaward or not, or you have fully completed your budget within the budget workspace, you would come back to your funding proposal here and you would hit the create update SF-424 activity to create your SF-424 module for this proposal. All right, so this is asking you which of the forms you would like to add into this SF-424 package. So it pre-selects the required forms, and then you have the option to select the other forms depending on what budget type you're using, whether or not you have a subaward or your assignment request form. So we're going to use the R&R budget, and we are going to include our subaward attachment. And so after my page refreshes here, you will see that you now have a link to your SF-424 package right here in the middle of your funding proposal workspace. So we're going to navigate to that SF-424. And if we were working with a sub-site and we needed to send them the budget form for completion, this is now where we could download the R&R subaward budget form. Again, we don't have to yet complete anything else within the SF-424 if we're still very early in our process, but this is how you would get that form to send out to your collaborators. So I'm going to dive right into editing the SF-424 grant application. But again, this workspace should look familiar to you, identified up here by the SF-424 field in the right corner. You have a series of activities here on the left side menu, just as with any other workspace. And you have a history tab that will show you as you move through the process of the SF-424, the activity associated with that. So similar to all of the other workspaces, you click your edit button that will take you into your smart forms for this activity. So it's showing us again the optional forms that we've selected. If we decided at that point that we wanted to switch from an R&R budget to a modular, we could make that change here on this page, and the package would update automatically for us. So this is where you'll start to see information that has pulled in both from your funding proposal and your budget, as well as information, institutional information that's built into the system that should default for your SF-424 cover page. So these fields should all be very familiar to you if you're used to working with Assist or with Workspace. But the type of application could be selected, for example, to be change corrected if this were an application that we had already submitted and needed to make changes to. All of your standard agency and federal identifier fields are here. Your institutional information will default, again, based on information in the system or information we have input on the funding proposal. For example, the department and division, the address should all of that information should pre-fill in your smart form cover page here. The person to be contacted should default to the specialist identified for your unit. This could potentially be changed depending on the standard process for your school or your unit. For example, in School of Medicine, I know that I am listed as the person to be contacted, even though I will not be necessarily a named specialist for every department in our school. So this information may need to be changed or updated depending on the specific process for your unit. The employer identification number should pre-fill, as well as the type of application. And again, a lot of this information should pull in and not need to be edited or changed. There's a question in the chat: are the fields remembered from proposal to proposal? Not necessarily from proposal to proposal, but they are pre-filled based on information in the funding proposal or institutional information that's built into the background of the system. So what you see here that's defaulted will default similarly in every SF-424. The PI defaults based on the funding proposal information that we've put in. The project funding will pull in from the budget. Again, if you were to need to make changes to your budget, for example, you would need to go back to your budget workspace, make those changes, and then feed them forward, and all of this information would automatically update at that point from your budget workspace. We do have to click the I agree button that we should all be familiar with. And then your authorized representative information will also default from institutional information in the system. Project performance and site location will pull over from the information included in the funding proposal. But again, all of these fields remain editable. If there was some reason that you needed to change or edit or update this, you could do so. And then your subaward site will also pull over based on information identified in your funding proposal. You can click into each of these to ensure that all of the necessary information is completed so that you don't run into a validation error down the road. So for example, we identified University of Florida as the organization on our subaward budget, but we do not have their address. Ooh, I can't type. So we will need to complete this information to ensure that our form will validate. And so again, as we move through each of these smart forms, these should correspond to the tabs you would see in Assist or the pages that you would see in Workspace. This should all be familiar information and should be organized in a way that is very familiar to you from other systems that we've been working with. The human subject and animal subject information is pulled over from the funding proposal. As I mentioned before, we had indicated on our funding proposal that our IACUC review was not yet submitted. That corresponds to a pending designation in the SF-424. But our institutional AWA number, or if we had human subjects, our FWA number would pull in from the system. These additional questions at the bottom are not questions that we have previously answered on the funding proposal. So these would be things that we would need to respond to directly in the SF-424. And these are the types of things that I mentioned previously. If you needed to make changes in your funding proposal or your budget, and you wanted to push those forward and you didn't select only the fields that need changing, for example, and you accidentally allowed it to change all of the funding, the SF-424 pages, all of this information would revert to not being responded to or being cleared out. So you'd have to come back and re-enter all of this information again. So I'll just go through each of these quickly. Again, they should be questions that are familiar to you from Assist or from Workspace. And then you can upload your proposal attachments here. So for our exercise, you should have all received a zip file of proposal attachments that you can use, just dummy attachments that you can use when you're working through your exercise later. But you can pull these in. You can give the attachment a different name if you'd like. This doesn't change the file name of the attachment. It just changes the title that's visible within the proposal form. And again, please let us know now in the chat if you did not receive or have any trouble opening the zip files of attachments. We do want you to have those available as you're working through your exercise so that you can easily move through the upload fields. But as you also certainly have the option, of course, of using attachments that you may have on your desktop or in your computer. So I also wanted to point out, as we're working through these, you'll see that each attachment, as we upload it, gets a version identifier here at the end of the file name. If you needed to upload a revision, for example, then that version identifier should update to show you that you've now included a second version of the abstract, for example. So now you can see the version identifier as 02. All right, so once you've got your attachments uploaded here, we can move forward to our senior key person page, which should pull forward the information from our funding proposal. Key personnel that we have identified in the funding proposal will move forward into the SF-424. So our PI information with all the associated demographics are included here. Also, just another note, depending on what PI you used in your earlier sessions, I'm not sure that all faculty, if you were using a real life UVA faculty, currently have their Commons ID in the system. And so in order to validate the application, you may need to change your PI to Rebecca Sims, which is the Huron sort of default profile that has a fake Commons ID that will allow the validation to go through. So just keep that in mind for your exercise down the road. But again, all of this should be familiar. We've already identified the project role. Our bio sketch that we included in our funding proposal has pulled forward. And then we also have entries for our other senior key personnel. You can see that you can adjust the display order here. That's a feature that's not available currently, I think, in Assist. If you wanted to reorder the way that the personnel appear, we can do that. And then within each of these profiles, you could go through to add demographic information. To ensure that your proposal will validate. Any faculty members pulling over from Workday should have all of this information completed in the system already. So I'm filling this out because these are fake profiles, but you should have that information already completed if you're using actual faculty once we get into the live system. I believe I had already created the demographic profile for our subaward PI in the funding proposal, yes, and so all of that pulled forward. And if at this point we did need to add additional profiles or bio sketches, we could do that here. But again, really, we should go back to our funding proposal and make changes there, feed that information forward as needed. There's a question in the chat. If the senior key personnel have not completed their ERA profile, will that cause an error? Do they need to make sure it's completed? So this is not going to pull forward information from ERA Commons. So the information that's fed here will be internally from the Workday information that we have on file. And so it may need to be updated or changed, but if any of that information is blank in our Workday system and then corresponds to a required field on the SF-424, it will create a validation error if it's not completed. So it's always good to click into each of those personnel and check to make sure all the required fields are completed, including their ERA Commons ID. The Commons ID is something that we're working on getting into the Huron system in the background information, so that that should feed in automatically from that Workday feed. All right, again, these are familiar questions from our normal Assist or workspace activities. Some of them are pre-fed from our funding proposal. We had indicated back on the funding proposal that there would be no program income, for example. But then some of these are questions that were not addressed previously. So we need to make sure we include that information here. The budget information will all pull forward from the budget workspace that we've previously completed. So including general demographic information about the institution, but you do have to upload your budget justification within the SF-424 directly. And then if you wanted to drill down into each of these budget periods to double check the information, you could certainly do that. But again, it's all fed forward. So if you have confidence in the budget you created in the budget workspace, you should be good to go. The cumulative budget information is included at the bottom of the page here. But again, just to kind of show you what this looks like, we'll drill down into an initial budget period. It's pulled forward our personnel, all of our salary and effort information, as well as our OTPS. So again, format should be very familiar to you, should look very similar to what we're used to seeing. Cognizant agency information will default based on institutional information in the system. So all of that should be pretty straightforward. But if you did need to make changes, or if you drilled into each of these and identified changes that are made, again, going back to your budget workspace and making those changes to push them forward is going to be the most efficient way to do that. And so if you remember when I created this, this SF-424, I had not yet uploaded the subaward document into my budget proposal. So I do not have a subaward populated here in this form. I'm going to have to go back to my budget workspace, upload that document, and then push it forward. And so we'll do that in just a minute. Jeff, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick question. When you make changes to your budget in the SF-424, or even when you download from the funding proposal, does it automatically populate the cumulative amount in the cover? Or do you have to manually change it? Like
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch it. Does it automatically populate? Say that again.
Does the cumulative total of your budget in the SF-424 automatically populate the amount that's in the cover page?
Yes, it does. So that feeds forward from the budget workspace. And so if you make changes on the budget workspace, then update the SF-424 accordingly, that will revise or refresh that cover page amount as well. Sure. Yeah, that's another nice change from current state, where if you make changes in Assist or Workspace, you have to go backwards then and remember to make those on the SF-424 cover page. All right, so you may have noticed as I tried to click continue, it was giving me a validation error because I have no subaward budget uploaded. I can navigate from my menu on the left-hand side to the next page, and then I'm gonna go back in just a minute and update my subaward budget so that we can pass that validation error. But the research plan page is where you would upload all of your main technical documents. I'm just going to upload the basics that are required to get us through the validations here. One thing I want to point out here, and this is something that we've been having discussions, with different schools and units as we've been working through our process documents, is that in order to validate the submission before you push it forward to your department or your specialist for review, you will have to have documents uploaded here so that the system validations can pass. You may decide to do it differently in your units, but I think what we've talked about advising people is to create sort of a set of dummy documents or draft documents that are very obviously those things, that their file names say something like dummy research strategy or dummy specific aims, draft specific aims, so that you can pass the validation check before you then upload the final science documents prior to submission. Again, this is potentially something that's very specific to the School of Medicine because of our internal deadline policy. But I know that a lot of other units have been talking about adopting a similar process, maybe not necessarily the deadline policy, but a process for validating the submission prior to sending it forward for review, with the option to then swap out final science documents, closer to the deadline. So in order to do that, you will have to have something uploaded into these fields, even if they're draft or sort of blank dummy documents. And they will have to have individual file names as well. So you can't just create one dummy document and use it for each of these fields. You'll have to have a specific file name for each one, because the system does also check for individual files. All right, so I think I've uploaded the minimum that I need here. Oops, I need to upload my consortium document because I do have a subaward, but to get us through, just to get us through the validations. And then, of course, the last page being our human subjects and clinical trials page. So we don't have any human subjects on this proposal. And so I want to point out here, because we've just been talking about validations as well. So there are two different ways to validate the SF-424 within the Huron system. On this last form page, smart form page of the SF-424 module, just like in the other smart forms, you have this validate button that will check the smart forms for errors. This is different than the errors that potentially be checked against your sponsors' validations within their systems. So you can see here that it's identified a number of errors. It links directly to those sections, so I can go back and make changes specifically. Here, I neglected to include the congressional district of my subaward performance site. So I can add that I can link that by clicking directly on that identifier there, and then it will take me right back to that section of that field that needs to be updated. And then as I make those changes and I click save on that page, it automatically reruns this validation check, and then should clear that error from the list. Okay, so it did clear that error. I can move on to my next one, which is that I did not indicate a zip code for my co-investigator, Joe Bloggs. So you can see, sorry, I clicked off of that pretty quickly, but hopefully you notice that that field was not marked with a red asterisk. It is not necessarily a required field for the smart form, but obviously is a required form for the SF-424 submission, as we all know. And so the validation is checking against those requirements for our sponsor submission, which may be different than the requirements within the smart form. And so we've now cleared that error. The last remaining error is that we are missing our subaward budget, which we knew was the case. So I'm now going to exit out of my smart forms. I'm going to navigate back to my budget workspace, upload my subaward budget attachment, and then I'm going to push those updates forward to my SF-424. And so to do that, I'm going to use my breadcrumbs to navigate back to my funding proposal. And then I'm going to navigate to my budget workspace. And then into my subaward budget workspace. And so once I've clicked into that, I can edit my subaward budget and upload that form that my collaborator has completed and sent to me. This should also be the subaward sample budget is also something that should have been available to you in your budget session that you would have completed previously. But if you need that example for your exercise that we're going to do in just a bit, let us know and we can send that around. Okay, so I have an error in my subaward budget because it does not, the budget periods do not match. I'm assuming they do not match my funding proposal. So let me double check that. Sorry, I'm trying to open my subaward budget so I can double check those dates.
Yeah, it's a key thing to note when you guys get budgets back from subs. If there's any discrepancy in the period dates, then it'll give you an error.
Okay, so my budget dates here are 7/1/22, and that should go all the way through 6/30/27. So I'm going to navigate back to my funding to see if that matches. I apologize for all of the spinning. As I said, this should all move much faster in our live production. Oh, actually, I think I know what the issue is here. I don't think it's that it doesn't match my funding proposal. I think it's that I don't have these extra zeros here. There we go. So that's an error in the budget form, not a discrepancy between my funding proposal and the form. So yeah, as Stephen said, it's a great idea when you get these back from your subaward site to double check all of the information.
The little things in life. All right. All right, so I'm going to navigate now back to my subaward budget workspace, smart form, I apologize, and see if now we can upload this and clear that error. right, navigating back to our budget. And then into our subaward. All right, and now we've cleared our error, our subaward budget is uploaded, and so now we need to push these changes forward to our SF-424. So in order to do that, we're going to navigate back to our funding proposal workspace. Oh, I did also mean to show you on the budget page, but you can see here that our total budget information has also been updated. If I won't navigate back because of how long it's taking, but if you had looked at the funding proposal summary, you'll now see the subaward line is added there. So we're going to use our create update SF-424 activity here. And we're going to choose only to update the subaward budget because that's the only section that we have made changes to, and we don't want to overwrite any of the other information that we've already put in. So as you can see, it defaults to selecting all of the forms that we previously included. So we want to make sure that we uncheck each of these that we don't want to make any changes to, leaving only our subaward budget form to be changed. That's really, really important to make sure that you don't have to redo a bunch of data entry that you've already previously completed. And you'll see as it moves through the status, it'll indicate that it skipped all of these other forms, only completed changes to the R&R subaward budget. So now if we navigate back into our SF-424, we should be able to run our validation and see that hopefully we've cleared all of our errors in our SF-424 now. So there's a question in the chat, if you don't uncheck those items, wouldn't they remain the same, including the revisions that have been made? So they will not remain, it will not keep any changes that you've made in the SF-424. Information from the funding proposal that fed over will still remain the same, but data that you've indicated specifically in the SF-424 will be changed or will be overwritten or defaulted back to blank or zero. All right, so in our SF-424, we're going to go back into edit our grant application, run our validation check, and hopefully see that we've cleared all of our smart form errors.
Okay, so we have cleared our errors. We've now got a few additional warnings. So the email address for the person to be contacted was not included. It says that the AOR address used on the cover page will be indicated on the cover page will be used instead. That's fine. It's a warning, not an error that we have to clear. So in the interest of time, I'm going to push these forward. All right, so we can now exit out of our SF-424 smart form, and we come to our last step, which again could vary by school or department. So be sure you check with your submitting office. But the last step, I think for most of us in this case, will be to use this validate submission activity on the workspace. So this is a different validation than the one that we just ran within the smart forms. This validate submission will lock down the SF-424 from any changes by study staff and PIs. So the changes will still be able to be made by the specialist, but unless they unlock or reopen the SF-424, once it's validated, you will no longer be able to make changes to it. So you want to be certain that it's ready to be submitted forward. Again, this is also why you'll need to upload dummy documents if you are using draft versions of your technical items like your specific aims or your research plan. In order to pass the validations, you'll need to have drafts included in the form at that point. So we are hopefully ready to push this forward. We're going to validate our submission. This is going to run all of our submission checks just the same as Assist would or Workspace would before submitting in either of those platforms. We're expecting to probably see some of the same warnings that we got within the smart form validations, but hopefully nothing additional and no additional errors. And that appears to be the case. So we're going to continue, and you will see on the workspace that our the state or the status of our SF-424 is going to update to valid for submission. You can also, as you click through these interstitial pages, check these two boxes to ensure that any fillable PDFs or special characters will be converted for submission through Grants.gov. So PDFs will be flattened, special characters will be updated so that they can be included in the submission. So we're moving from a pre-submission state as it moves through the validation into a valid for submission state. And so at this point, you would then now navigate back to your funding proposal, and you would submit your funding proposal forward for department review and then eventually on to specialist review. Again, we're not gonna follow that process today. If in your exercise breakout rooms you want to try to work through that process, we can certainly do that. One thing I did want to say though is sort of related to the fact that the SF-424 is valid for submission, and you can no longer make changes to it. The way that we're going to update final science documents that we may need to change closer to the deadline if we have used drafts or dummy documents in our initial submission is the activity that I'm not seeing. Hang on. Stephen or Mary Beth or anybody else from the core team, do you know why I'm not seeing the update SF-424 research plan activity here?
I think it's once it's in department review, it shows up.
Oh, the funding. Okay.
Yeah. Either department or specialist or both.
All right. Okay, so once I will do that just so we can show that option. But I did want to also point out, So from the SF-424 workspace, you can generate a PDF if you want to send to your faculty for them to review, similar to Assist or Workspace, where you can preview the entire file. You can generate a PDF version here, and it will put the whole package together so that you can send just one file to them to look over and review. And once you've generated that PDF, the link to download that file will show up in the middle of your workspace. Right here under PDF versions, you'll have this view link, and that's where you can download the PDF to send to your faculty member. Again, looking over the history tab, just to call attention to this again, you can see that we've got a chronological timeline started now of different activities that have been completed on our SF-424. So we validated the submission, and then we generated the PDF, and it's tracking all of those. So I will go back to my, I said I wasn't going to do this, but I will go back to the funding proposal workspace, and I'll move this forward for department review so that we can see how we would update the science documents, or the research plan tab of the proposal, in order to submit final versions of technical information closer to our sponsor's deadline. So to move something forward for department review, you would use that submit for department review activity. You could include comments, or if you had any additional supporting documents here on this screen, and then it will route forward in the system based on the reviewers that you've identified for your department, which is information that lives in the system and is predefined for each unit. So you can see that the state here has updated from draft to department review. In our flow bubble, we can see that we've moved from draft to department review here. And now we do have the update SF-424 research plan activity. So this activity will allow you to swap out attachments in the research plan tab of the SF-424 without making changes to any other section of the application. So it does not reopen the SF-424 for data or field updates. It doesn't make any changes to any other part of the application, but it will allow you to overwrite these documents that have previously been uploaded. So for example, you can upload your specific aims, your final version of your research strategy, an abstract, or your bibliography. Any of these can be changed out for final versions without touching any other part of the application. And so that's the mechanism that we're going to use in School of Medicine, and I think most other units are going to use as well, in order to validate the submission, to send it forward for department or specialist review, but then still be able to swap out those final files before submission to the sponsor. So there's a question in the chat: is there a way to send a copy of the application to the PI through Huron? Yes, so you can generate that PDF as I just showed you on the SF-424 workspace, and then you can use this send email activity to send that directly to the PI. The email will come out of the system. The PI cannot respond within the system. It will not come back to you within the system, but you can generate it directly from here. You can indicate your subject line and your recipients. You can choose from the group of administrators or team members associated with the proposal, or you can list a single recipient here. Comments and documents can be added. And then there's another question: when you say it will allow you to overwrite the research documents, do you mean grants and contracts or the department level users? So this update SF-424 research plan should be available to study staff, which is going to be department level users, PI, anybody who's named on the application. So you'll be able to make those changes without having to come through grants and contracts or your submitting office, for example. All right, there was another similar question about swapping out the documents. Okay, that looks like all the questions in the chat. So at this point, your department reviewer would either request changes and send the proposal back to the study staff or send it forward for specialist review, at which point we could then submit it directly to the sponsor. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of that. I know we need to get to our exercise, to our breakout rooms, but any questions, anything I missed or that you want to talk about before we go into our breakout rooms? Okay. Mary Beth, are you managing the breakout rooms?
I am. Let me open them. So Cecilia's in room 1 with the grants test site. Lauren, you've got room 2, also grants test. Catherine, room 3 with grants test. Stephen has the group that is using the grants site, and Alex has room 5 with the grants test. I will stay in the main room, so if anyone has any questions or technical difficulties, you could always pop back into the main room to ask questions.